Amina, just 17, had once been the picture of youth and joy in her small African village, a place where the land was rich with life, but where the harshness of daily survival weighed on everyone. The village was nestled between green hills and wide stretches of open land, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, but rarely stepped out of line. It was a place of community, but for Amina, it had become a prison. After her mother passed away, a soft-spoken woman who had been Amina's world, life changed irrevocably. Her mother had been her protector, her guide, and her source of warmth. But now, Amina was left to face the cruelty of a new reality, living under the oppressive control of her stepfather, Kofi. Kofi was a man who had lived in the shadows of the village for many years, known for his coldness and the odd distance he kept from others. Amina's mother had married him in a desperate attempt to find stability after her first husband had died, but she had been blinded by her desire for safety and hadn't seen the darkness that lurked in Kofi's heart. It wasn't long after her mother's death that Kofi's true nature emerged. His affection for Amina vanished with the death of her mother, replaced by cruelty and demands that stripped away every ounce of the warmth the family once had. Amina became the sole target of his anger. The household chores that her mother used to manage now fell solely on her shoulders. Every morning, she woke early, her body stiff from the last night's sleep on the thin mattress she had to share with the dirt floor beneath it. She fetched water from the well, cooked meals over an open fire, and scrubbed the floors until they gleamed. If anything was out of place, no matter how small the mistake, Kofi's rage was quick to follow. His blows were swift and merciless, aimed at breaking her spirit. Sometimes, they were quick slaps, other times long, drawn-out sessions where he yelled at her for hours, telling her she was worthless, reminding her that no one cared for her. His hands were rough, calloused from years of labor, and they left marks on her skin that were invisible to others but burned in her soul. The villagers saw the marks too. The welts, the bruises, the hollow look in her eyes that no child should ever have to wear. They saw how Kofi treated her like an animal, feeding her scraps of food, making her sleep outside in the cold while he and his friends ate and laughed in their warm home. Yet, no one spoke up. No one intervened. The village was small, and Kofi's reputation as a man to be feared was well known. People whispered about his bad temper, about how his threats were not just words, but promises. If anyone crossed him, they knew the consequences would be severe. So they looked the other way, offering Amina no help, no refuge. Amina was alone, entirely alone. She had no one to turn to, no one who would risk standing up for her. Her mother's death had left a gaping hole in her life, and now, even the thought of family felt like a distant memory. Her relatives were far away, and none of them had ever cared enough to check in on her. The reality of her situation suffocated her, and while she still clung to a tiny flicker of hope that something might change, a part of her began to believe that escape was impossible. Every night, after Kofi had gone to sleep, Amina would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the village drifting through the window. The laughter of children playing, the conversations of neighbors, the singing of women who worked together to prepare food for the next day. All of it felt so far out of reach. Amina would close her eyes, trying to imagine herself somewhere else, a different life, perhaps in the city, where she could run free and forget the pain. But she didn't have the strength or the means to leave. There was no one to help her escape, no one to protect her from the man who controlled her life. Her dreams of freedom were becoming more distant with each passing day, like a song she had once known but could no longer remember the words to. Yet, every morning, she would rise again. She would take her place in the endless cycle of chores and beatings, hoping, somewhere deep inside, that one day something would change. That maybe, just maybe, the village would see her pain and do something about it. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, and Amina's hope began to wither, like a flower starved of sunlight. But in the silence of her suffering, a seed of defiance was quietly taking root. Amina had begun to notice the cracks in Kofi's armor, the ways in which he was not as invincible as he seemed. Slowly, without even realizing it, she started to plan her escape. Though she didn't know how or when it would happen, she vowed that she would not let her life be reduced to nothing more than endless suffering. Her body might be under his control, but her mind and spirit? That, she would hold on to. For now, though, the reality of her life was too harsh to ignore. Every moment, every breath, felt like a struggle for survival. The village may have been silent, but inside her, Amina was anything but. The fight to reclaim her freedom had already begun, quietly and steadily, and soon, Kofi would see that no amount of cruelty could break her spirit. Amina's memories of her childhood felt like fleeting dreams, so full of light and warmth that sometimes, it was hard to remember a time when her heart had been light. She would often retreat into these memories in the quiet moments between her endless chores, longing for the days when laughter filled the air of their small home, when love was a constant, and when she felt safe. Her mother, gentle and kind, had been the center of Amina's universe. Together, they had been a team, creating a little world of their own, where love and care flowed freely. Her mother's voice was still clear in Amina's mind, like the sound of wind chimes on a peaceful afternoon. She had a calming presence, always ready with a smile or a word of encouragement. The kitchen, where they spent most of their time, had been the heart of their home. The scent of freshly baked bread and simmering stew always filled the air, and the sound of Amina's mother humming as she worked was a melody Amina could never forget. Her mother taught her everything: how to cook, how to weave baskets, how to care for the animals that roamed near their home. She had a patient hand, a soft touch, and a wisdom that Amina adored. But beyond the practical lessons, her mother had filled Amina's heart with dreams. Amina had once wanted to become a teacher, a hope she had harbored ever since she was a little girl. Her mother would tell her that education was the key to freedom, that no one could ever take away what you learned. The days when they sat together under the shade of the large mango tree in their yard, her mother reading her stories of distant lands and brave women who overcame their struggles, were the days Amina cherished the most. Those stories made her believe that one day, she too would be able to escape the smallness of the village, find her purpose, and make a difference in the world. Before Kofi entered their lives, there had been joy, uninterrupted, pure joy. Amina's world had been full of possibilities, and her heart had been full of hope. Even the simplest things felt like magic. She would run barefoot through the fields with her friends, laughing until her sides ached, and her mother would wave from the door, calling her to come home for supper. Life had been simple, but in those days, simplicity was all they needed. They were happy in their little world. But when Amina's mother fell ill, everything began to change. It happened slowly at first, a cough that wouldn't go away, a fever that lingered too long. Amina had watched helplessly as the woman she loved most in the world grew weaker by the day. Her mother's once strong hands became frail, her voice barely above a whisper. The warmth in their home began to fade, replaced by the cold shadow of sickness. Kofi, who had never been overly affectionate, seemed to withdraw even more. He became more distant, more irritable. But it wasn't until after her mother's death that the true darkness of Kofi's nature emerged. In the days following her mother's funeral, Amina had hoped that Kofi would step in and take care of her. He was her stepfather, after all. But instead, he became a stranger in their home, treating her like an outsider. He was no longer the man he had once appeared to be, a man who had smiled at her mother and pretended to be kind. His cruelty had always been lurking beneath the surface, and now it erupted with a vengeance. The moments of tenderness that had once existed between them vanished, replaced by harsh commands and violent punishments. It was almost as if Kofi had waited for her mother to be gone before he revealed his true self. His temper flared at every minor inconvenience, and Amina became the target of his frustration. She would make one small mistake, perhaps she burned the dinner, or the house wasn't clean to his exacting standards, and he would lash out, hitting her, calling her worthless, reminding her how much she had ruined everything. He took pleasure in watching her shrink away, in making her feel small and insignificant. It was as if her very presence reminded him of everything he resented about his life. The dreams Amina once held so tightly began to wither. She no longer spoke of becoming a teacher, the very thought of a future outside the walls of her suffering seemed impossible. The laughter that had once come easily to her lips was gone. She was no longer the bright, hopeful girl she had once been. In her place was a girl who had been broken, whose spirit was suffocated by the weight of Kofi's cruelty. The contrast between her past and present was like a cruel joke, an unbearable reminder of what had been taken from her. Sometimes, she would catch herself in the reflection of a passing window, and the girl staring back at her was almost unrecognizable. Her eyes, once full of life and curiosity, had grown dull, heavy with the burden of years of pain. She had lost her ability to dream, to see beyond the walls of her prison. Instead, she was consumed by the fight for survival, by the constant need to avoid Kofi's wrath and keep the peace in their home. It was this painful juxtaposition, the girl who had once been full of hope, who had danced in the fields with her mother, and the girl who now endured abuse in silence, that tore at Amina's heart every single day. The dream of escaping her torment seemed more and more distant as time went on, and the idea of ever reclaiming the joy she had once known seemed impossible. But somewhere deep inside, Amina held on to the fragments of that girl who had believed in something better. And as much as Kofi tried to destroy her spirit, she wasn't completely gone, not yet. Kofi's cruelty had always been simmering beneath the surface, but now, it seemed to have no limits. Amina could feel the tightening grip of his control over her life, each passing day more unbearable than the last. He had already stripped her of her dignity and warmth, but now he was taking everything else. The love her mother had once shown her, the kindness she had felt from the village, all of it seemed so distant, as if it had never existed at all. Kofi had made sure of that. The most harrowing part of this new reality was the way Kofi treated her, less like a human being and more like an animal, a servant, a thing that existed only to meet his needs. He forced her to eat the scraps left over from his meals, scraps that had been picked over and were often stale. These were the only meals she got, while Kofi and his friends ate well, savoring the food she had prepared with the same hands that would later be used to punish her. She would sit in the corner of the room, her stomach growling with hunger, gnawing on pieces of bread that had been thrown at her like they were nothing more than waste. Sometimes, there wouldn't even be enough to satisfy her hunger, and she would go to bed with an empty stomach, feeling the weight of the pain in her ribs. Her place in the home had been reduced to the lowest of the low, sleeping outside on a thin mat, exposed to the cold of the night, while Kofi and his visitors slept comfortably inside. He would laugh when he saw her shivering, mocking her weakness. "You think you're better than this, girl? You're nothing," he would sneer, his voice cold and unforgiving. And so she would stay, night after night, lying awake, staring up at the stars, wishing she could disappear into the darkness. But the worst of it, the thing that cut deepest into her soul, was the public humiliation. Kofi would whip her in front of the villagers, sometimes for a small mistake, sometimes for no reason at all. It was his way of asserting his dominance, of showing everyone that he was in control. He would call the villagers together, sometimes forcing her to kneel before them while he struck her with his leather belt, each lash a cruel reminder of her place in the world. The pain from the lashes would spread through her body like wildfire, but it wasn't just the physical pain that hurt. It was the shame, the unbearable humiliation of being made to suffer in front of others, her tears visible for everyone to see. The villagers, who had once been her neighbors, her community, watched in silence. Some would look away, others would whisper to each other, but no one ever stepped forward to stop him. They were all too afraid of Kofi's wrath. Amina tried, at first, to find someone, anyone, who might be willing to help her. She would look at the other girls her age, girls who had once been her friends, and beg with her eyes for them to say something, to do something. She had heard rumors of other girls who had escaped abusive situations, of women who had been helped by the elders, but those were just stories, stories that seemed to belong to someone else, not to her. When she tried to speak to the village healer, an elderly woman who had once been kind to her mother, she was met with a cold response. The healer simply shook her head, her eyes filled with fear. "You should not anger him," she warned. "Kofi has too much power in this village." Even the men who came to the house to drink with Kofi, men who had once been friendly with her mother, turned a blind eye. They would smile at her with false warmth, offering empty words of comfort, but when Kofi raised his hand to strike, they would avert their eyes and pretend not to see. Amina realized, in those moments, that she was utterly alone. There was no one who would stand up for her, no one who cared enough to risk Kofi's wrath. They all knew what he was capable of, and they were all too scared to challenge him. And then, one evening, something broke inside her. Kofi had been drinking heavily that night, his anger fueled by the alcohol coursing through his veins. The smallest mistake, a pot left on the stove too long, set him off. His face twisted with rage as he lunged at Amina, his fists striking her repeatedly, each blow landing with a sickening thud. He knocked her to the ground, and as she tried to crawl away, he kicked her in the ribs, sending waves of pain through her body. She could barely breathe, let alone stand. He hit her again and again, until she was unable to move, unable to escape the agony that consumed her. The world around her seemed to spin, her vision blurred by tears and pain. For a long moment, she lay there, her body trembling with the aftermath of the beating. Her skin burned where his fists had struck her, and her muscles ached, but it wasn't the physical pain that lingered the longest, it was the realization. Amina understood, in that moment, that no one was coming to save her. The villagers, the healer, even the world beyond the village, they weren't going to rescue her. If she wanted to escape this nightmare, it was up to her, and her alone. No one else would lift a finger. That night, as she lay on the cold floor, barely able to move, Amina made a vow to herself. She would not endure this forever. She would not let Kofi destroy her any more than he already had. She could no longer wait for someone else to act. She had to act, and act quickly. She had to find a way to free herself from his clutches, to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. Amina may have been broken in that moment, but she was not defeated. Her spirit had been battered, but it was not beyond repair. She could not wait for justice anymore, she would become her own justice. The seed of defiance had been planted, and in the days to come, she would begin to cultivate it, quietly and carefully. Because in the end, Amina knew one thing above all: if she wanted to survive, she would have to save herself. Amina lay in her small, cramped space, her bruised body aching from the punishment she had endured. But this time, something was different. The pain was still sharp, the exhaustion overwhelming, but beneath it all, there was a flicker of something else, something new. For the first time in a long while, she felt the stirrings of resolve, a quiet but fierce determination that began to take root in her heart. She realized that she couldn't simply endure Kofi's cruelty forever. Waiting for him to tire of his abuse, waiting for someone to come to her aid, it wasn't enough. She had to take control. And to do that, she needed to fight back, not with physical strength, but with cunning and strategy. Kofi was strong and cruel, and she was neither. He had beaten her, broken her, and yet she knew that if she tried to confront him head-on, it would end in her defeat. But there was one thing that Kofi had underestimated: her ability to observe, to understand the world around her, and to use that knowledge to her advantage. Amina began to study him closely, watching his every move, learning his patterns, and uncovering his weaknesses. The first thing she noticed was Kofi's greed. It was something so blatant that even the other villagers had whispered about it behind his back. Kofi's greed controlled his every action. He was always scheming, looking for ways to make more money, to increase his standing in the village. The idea of wealth was an obsession for him, whether it was through his small trade in livestock or through the rumors he spread about his supposed influence with the village elders. He always had a plan to make more, and his need for respect and status drove him to take desperate, often reckless, actions. Amina had seen him time and time again speak of making deals with people in the village, often exploiting the weak or the desperate. He had even spoken in front of her about selling her to the highest bidder in an arranged marriage. He had no qualms about treating her as a commodity, something to be traded for profit, and this was something Amina could use. Kofi's need for money, and the way he had no moral boundaries when it came to obtaining it, was a weakness she could exploit. The second weakness Amina noted was his addiction to alcohol. Kofi drank heavily every night, sometimes in the company of his friends, sometimes alone. The alcohol was his escape, his way of numbing the emptiness inside him, but it also made him reckless and vulnerable. After a long day of labor or dealing with the pressures of his failed businesses, he would drink to forget. Amina could tell how the alcohol clouded his judgment and dulled his ability to make rational decisions. On many occasions, she had seen him stagger, barely able to stand, his words slurred and his temper more unpredictable. This, too, was a flaw, a crack in his otherwise hardened exterior. Amina knew that if she could somehow use his dependence against him, she might be able to gain a small advantage. She began watching how much alcohol he consumed, noting the patterns of his drinking. She saw that after drinking, he was more careless, more willing to trust people, or in her case, to ignore her entirely. This gave her an opportunity to work unnoticed, to begin making subtle plans. The third, and perhaps most crucial weakness, was his need for respect from the villagers. Kofi was obsessed with maintaining a facade of power, of being seen as the man in charge. It wasn't enough for him to be feared, he needed to be admired, to be recognized as someone who commanded authority. He craved status, and he needed the villagers to believe in his strength. In reality, his power was fragile, built on fear and lies. The moment that people started doubting him or questioning his position, his entire world could come crumbling down. Amina understood that Kofi's pride was something she could chip away at, that his reputation was something she could destroy if she played her cards right. He had spent years cultivating this image of himself as a strong, powerful man, and it was all held together by the respect of the villagers. If she could undermine that respect, if she could slowly turn the tide of opinion against him, his power would begin to erode. With these observations in mind, Amina began to strategize. She knew she couldn't act too quickly, she had to be patient. Her plan needed to unfold in the shadows, so Kofi wouldn't see it coming. So, she began taking small steps, things that seemed insignificant at first but would eventually set the stage for her escape. She started by hiding food. When Kofi wasn't looking, she would take small portions of the food he had set aside for himself, storing it in secret places around the house. Some days, she would sneak extra bread from the kitchen or store leftover vegetables in her room. It wasn't much, but it was enough to build a small stash of food that she could use in case things got worse. But more than just food, Amina began saving her energy. Every day, Kofi demanded more and more from her. The chores piled up, and he expected perfection, otherwise, there would be consequences. But Amina had learned to ration her strength, to pace herself. She would take longer breaks when Kofi wasn't looking, resting when she could. She didn't allow herself to be worn out by the endless demands. Each time he punished her, she would bear it with silence, knowing that the time would come when her silence would serve her purpose. In the evenings, when Kofi was passed out drunk, she would spend her time quietly observing his movements, listening to his slurred conversations with the few villagers he allowed into his home. She began to learn even more about his connections, who he traded with, who feared him, who had debts that needed paying. Slowly, she began to piece together the map of his power, and she realized that his influence, while real, wasn't unshakable. One night, as she sat quietly in her corner, Amina made a vow to herself: she would not be a victim for the rest of her life. She had no power, no allies, and no voice in the world. But she would fight back, not with anger, but with strategy. She would be patient, she would be careful, and most importantly, she would never stop watching, learning, and waiting for the right moment. Because she knew that when that moment came, she would be ready. One evening, as the air grew thick with the scent of evening dew, Amina found herself once again listening to Kofi's drunken ramblings in the dimly lit corner of the house. He had been in a foul mood all day, his anger barely contained beneath his slurred words, and Amina knew better than to speak. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional grunt or laugh from Kofi as he recounted his plans to the group of men gathered around him. She had gotten used to the way he spoke of her, his condescending tone, the way he saw her as little more than property. But that night, something changed. She was dusting the shelves near the door, trying to keep her presence unnoticed, when Kofi's words pierced through the haze of his alcohol-induced stupor. "You know," he slurred, "I've been thinking. I could make a tidy sum off this one. Amina's ripe for a good marriage deal, and if I sell her off to one of those traders from the big town, I'll get a good price. More than enough to settle the debts and maybe buy a few cattle. I'm telling you, it's a good deal. And she'll be someone else's problem." The words struck Amina like a bolt of lightning, her heart sinking into her stomach. The thought of Kofi selling her, of being sold like some commodity, as if her life had no worth beyond what could be bargained for, was a blow she hadn't anticipated. Her chest tightened, and her breath caught in her throat as the weight of the situation pressed down on her. She had known that Kofi's cruelty knew no bounds, but this felt like a final condemnation, a life sentence of misery. She had never been more aware of how trapped she was. The village had turned its back on her, no one would lift a finger to help her. She had no family left to turn to, no allies to rely on. If Kofi followed through with this plan, she would be tied to a stranger, forced to live a life that would be even worse than the one she had now. The thought of being married off to a man who might be even more brutal than Kofi, to a life of submission and suffering, sent a shudder down her spine. There would be no escape, no freedom. She would be nothing more than a possession, a servant to another man's whims. But Amina's mind was already working, turning the situation over in her head. She couldn't fight back now. Not yet. If she made a scene, if she resisted, she would only make things worse. Kofi was already convinced he could do whatever he wanted with her, and any sign of defiance would give him a reason to tighten his grip further. She had to bide her time, to play along with his plans, pretending to obey. She would pretend to be just another compliant victim in his eyes, waiting for the right moment to act. She nodded silently to herself, her hands still clutching the cloth she was using to dust the shelves. Her body ached, but the surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins made her feel oddly alert. She had to stay patient. She had to wait for the perfect moment when she could turn the tables on him. That night, after the men had stumbled out of the house, leaving Kofi passed out drunk, Amina sat by the small fire outside, her mind racing. The oppressive silence of the night only seemed to amplify her thoughts. The moon hung high in the sky, casting its silver glow over the land, but Amina didn't see the beauty of it. She saw only the darkness that loomed over her, a darkness that had been cast by the very man who was supposed to care for her. She thought of her mother then, her memory coming to her like a soft whisper in the night. She remembered the way her mother had always known the right thing to say, how her words had a way of soothing Amina's restless heart. Amina closed her eyes and let the memory wash over her. Her mother had always told her that life could be cruel, that there would be times when everything seemed lost, when the world turned its back on you. But she had also told her something else, something that Amina had never truly understood until now. A cornered animal fights the hardest, her mother had said, her voice firm and steady, the way it always was when she imparted wisdom. When you have nothing left to lose, when there is no other choice, that's when you become stronger than you ever thought possible. And no matter how small you are, you can still rise up and fight. Amina's breath caught in her throat as the words echoed in her mind. She had heard them many times before, but tonight, they carried more weight than they ever had. For the first time, she understood the depth of her mother's words. A cornered animal, she had become one. She had been beaten down, silenced, and treated as nothing more than an object, but she was still alive. She still had her mind, her spirit, and above all, her will to survive. She looked up at the sky, her gaze fixed on the stars that shimmered above her. The night felt vast, endless, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the flicker of hope inside her, growing stronger with each passing moment. The time would come, she knew, when she would have to fight. And when that time came, she would fight with everything she had. Amina had been cornered for far too long. But now, the spark of resistance had been lit inside her. She would endure whatever Kofi threw her way, pretending to comply, biding her time, until the moment arrived when she would strike. And when she did, she would fight harder than she ever had before. Her mother's voice echoed in her ears, steady and unwavering. "You are stronger than you know, Amina. You will fight, and you will win." That night, as the cold breeze swept across the village, Amina finally understood what it meant to be free, to be in control of her own fate. She wasn't just going to survive anymore. She was going to take back what had been stolen from her. And when she did, Kofi would learn the hard way that he had underestimated her. The days following Amina's decision to fight back were the longest she had ever lived. Every morning, she woke with the weight of her plan pressing down on her, a constant reminder that her future, her freedom, depended on the careful execution of what she was about to do. She could feel the heaviness of the decision like a stone in her chest, but it was a weight she had come to accept. Kofi's cruelty had left her with no other choice. If she didn't act now, she would lose everything. The village was full of secrets, its people, its traditions, and the ancient wisdom that was passed down through generations. One of those secrets, one that had been whispered about by the elders and known only to the most trusted healers, was the knowledge of certain herbs that could cause illness, slow and gradual, without leaving any obvious trace. Amina had learned about them when she was younger, when her mother had taken her to visit the village healer. The healer had shown her the plants, explaining how they could be used for healing, but also for more sinister purposes. She had never thought that she would one day use that knowledge for something so dark. But in the depths of her suffering, Amina knew that it was the only way to weaken Kofi. The poison would be slow-acting, just enough to make him ill without drawing attention. The villagers would chalk it up to a common sickness, and Kofi's growing weakness would go unnoticed at first. She would have time. Time to watch him crumble, time to finally see him brought to his knees. Amina spent the following days gathering the herbs she needed. She knew exactly where to find them, hidden deep in the forest at the edge of the village, where the old trees cast long shadows and the air smelled of damp earth. There, among the undergrowth, grew the plants she needed, the small, unassuming leaves of the ebal plant, known for its mild toxic properties when consumed over time. The bark of the adan tree, which, when prepared correctly, could induce nausea, weakness, and eventually a slow decline in health. Amina knew how to combine these, how to dry them, grind them into a fine powder, and how to make them potent enough to carry out her plan. She spent hours in the quiet of the forest, her hands steady despite the storm raging in her chest. She could hear the whispers of the wind through the trees, almost as though the forest itself was telling her to move forward. When she returned home, she carefully prepared the poison. Her hands, though trembling slightly, were sure as she mixed the powdered herbs into the mortar, grinding them into a fine dust that would be nearly impossible to detect in any liquid. She knew exactly how much to use, just enough to weaken Kofi without making him violently ill. It had to be gradual, the sickness subtle at first, so no one would suspect foul play. The next step was just as crucial, she had to wait for the right moment to act. Every evening, Kofi drank heavily, often sitting alone in the corner of the room, muttering to himself about his plans for the village, for his business, for his supposed power. He trusted Amina to prepare his drinks, a routine that had become ingrained in their household. It was the perfect opportunity. As he slurred his words, oblivious to the danger that was being carefully mixed into his drink, Amina would silently watch, her heart pounding in her chest, knowing that she was about to take the first step toward his downfall. The first night she slipped the poison into his drink, Amina felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She had spent years enduring his cruelty, suffering in silence, but now, as she poured his drink, his favorite, a strong, dark brew made from fermented fruit, into his cup, there was a moment of finality. The poison swirled into the liquid, invisible, undetectable. She stirred it gently, making sure the mixture was even, then handed it to him with a small bow of her head. "Drink, Kofi," she said quietly, as though nothing had changed, as though she was still his dutiful, submissive daughter. Kofi took the drink without hesitation, muttering some dismissive words to her as he sank back into his chair. She left the room quietly, retreating to the small corner of the house where she had begun to retreat into herself over the last few weeks. She could hear him coughing softly, the faint sound of discomfort that would grow over the coming days. The next morning, Kofi was sluggish, his movements slower than usual, but he didn't seem to think much of it. "Too much to drink last night," he muttered to himself, though Amina could tell it wasn't just the alcohol that had him feeling this way. He had no idea that what he had consumed was slowly taking hold of him. Over the next few days, Kofi's health began to deteriorate. He complained of headaches and dizziness, his appetite waning. His usual energy, the domineering presence that he had used to control everyone around him, started to fade. Amina watched all of this in silence, her heart a strange mixture of guilt and satisfaction. She had spent years enduring his abuse, his physical and emotional torment, but now the tables were beginning to turn. It was a slow, methodical process, just as she had planned. Kofi grew weaker by the day, his once booming voice now reduced to a rasp, his body sluggish and uncoordinated. He had no idea what was happening to him. He blamed it on everything, his age, the heat, the stress of his work, but never once did he suspect that his suffering was the result of the very person he had tormented for years. Amina played the part of the dutiful daughter to perfection. She served him his meals, cleaned the house, and tended to his needs, all the while watching him suffer. It was an act of quiet vengeance, and with each passing day, she felt the weight of her years of suffering lifting ever so slightly. The joy was not in seeing him suffer, it was in knowing that the power he had once held over her was slipping away. She no longer feared him. In fact, she felt a strange sense of empowerment with every tremor, every weakness that overcame him. It was as though the poison had not only infiltrated his body but had also begun to eat away at his control over her life. She didn't smile at his suffering, not openly. She didn't want anyone to see that she was reveling in his downfall, but inside, she felt a quiet satisfaction. For the first time in her life, Amina knew what it felt like to have the upper hand, to have a plan that was working. And with each passing day, she grew more and more certain that the man who had terrorized her for so long was finally beginning to fall. As the days stretched on and Kofi's strength continued to fade, Amina's resolve hardened. It wasn't enough to weaken him in secret, she needed to make sure that the villagers saw him for what he truly was. She had lived in a community that had long been silent, turning a blind eye to the suffering that occurred behind closed doors. But now, Amina knew that the moment had come to break the silence. She could not stand by any longer while Kofi continued to rule through fear and intimidation. She had to make the village see him for the monster he had become, and in doing so, strip him of the power he still wielded over them. She began to spread rumors quietly, letting them slip into conversations when she visited the market or passed by the homes of the other villagers. At first, her words were subtle, just whispers of strange happenings, strange signs that pointed to something sinister. "Have you noticed," she would ask one of the older women, "how Kofi has become so ill? How his once strong body seems to wither before our eyes?" She would look around, then lower her voice, as though confiding in a trusted friend. "They say it's a curse, you know. That evil deeds catch up to a man like him. He's reaping what he sowed." The words were carefully chosen, meant to plant a seed of doubt in the minds of those around her. And they took root. Slowly, the villagers began to notice Kofi's deterioration, the way he had become a shadow of the man he once was. His eyes, once fierce and commanding, now appeared sunken and dull. His gait had become unsteady, and his once vibrant skin had taken on a pale, almost sickly hue. At first, it was easy for people to dismiss it. He was getting older, they thought, or maybe he had worked himself too hard. But as the days wore on and his condition worsened, more and more villagers began to whisper among themselves. Amina made sure that her part in the rumors was discreet. She acted innocent, always speaking with the feigned concern of a dutiful daughter, never allowing any suspicion to fall on her. When she spoke of the curse, she always made sure to look as though she were simply passing along what she had heard, a messenger, rather than a mastermind behind the whispers. But the truth was clear to her. The more the villagers whispered about Kofi's condition, the more they began to turn away from him. As Kofi's illness progressed, he became more desperate. He could no longer control the fear that had once kept the village in line. The fear he had relied on for so many years, the fear of his strength, his wrath, his influence, was slipping away. The villagers who had once feared him now exchanged glances of concern when he passed by. Some of them avoided him altogether, pretending not to see him or simply giving him a wide berth. Kofi, too proud and too blinded by his own arrogance, refused to accept that his power was waning. He could no longer walk into the center of the village with the same imposing presence he once had. Instead, he limped, his shoulders slumped, his eyes darting around nervously as though expecting the ground to collapse beneath him at any moment. His illness had left him vulnerable, and now, for the first time, Amina saw him as he truly was, a man who had abused his position for so long that when the world finally began to see through his facade, there was nothing left of him but a hollow shell. One afternoon, as Amina sat at the edge of the village square, she overheard a group of women talking in hushed tones. They were discussing Kofi's illness and the strange events that had started to unfold around him. "I heard he's been cursed," one woman said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Some say it's because of the terrible things he's done to his stepdaughter." Another woman nodded, her eyes filled with suspicion. "It's not just the sickness. Things around him seem off. His house is always dark, his fields are left untended. He's losing everything." Amina, sitting just out of sight, allowed herself a small smile. The rumors were spreading like wildfire now. She had done her work well, planting the seeds of doubt and watching them grow. She had been patient, and now the villagers were beginning to question everything they had once believed about Kofi. The fear that had once given him power was beginning to turn into something else: distrust, uncertainty, and a deepening suspicion. They were no longer afraid of him. They were afraid of what he had become, what his presence had wrought. Kofi, sensing that his power was slipping away, began to beg for help. One evening, when Amina returned from the market, she found him pacing in the yard, his face flushed with frustration. He called out to her, his voice hoarse. "Amina! Amina, come here." She walked toward him slowly, her eyes downcast, pretending to be the obedient daughter she had always been. "I need help," he pleaded, his voice shaking. "The villagers, they're turning their backs on me. They've abandoned me. I've always helped them. I've been their protector. Why are they doing this to me?" His words, desperate and broken, seemed so out of place coming from the man who had once ruled with an iron fist. Amina's heart raced, but she remained calm, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps," she began, her voice soft, almost sympathetic. "Perhaps they are afraid. Maybe they see your weakness, your illness, and they're afraid that you're not the man they thought you were." Kofi's eyes darkened, and he took a step toward her, his face twisted in anger. "You think they'll turn on me? After everything I've done for them?" His voice was rising, but Amina stood firm, her heart pounding as she fought to keep the triumph from showing on her face. "I think," she said, her voice steady, "that people are quick to forget. They forget the kindnesses you've shown them, but they remember the cruelty. And now, they are starting to see the truth. Maybe they've been waiting for you to show them who you really are." Kofi recoiled, his eyes narrowing. "You're lying. This isn't happening. They'll come back to me. They have to." Amina said nothing in reply. She knew that the more Kofi begged, the more desperate he became, the more the villagers would turn away. His grip on their respect had loosened, and it was slipping through his fingers like sand. The rumors had worked. The villagers no longer saw Kofi as the powerful man he once was. They saw him as a broken man, a man who was finally being held accountable for the suffering he had caused. As the days passed, the whispers grew louder, and Kofi's power over the village faded completely. Amina remained quiet, playing the part of the dutiful daughter, while in the background, the village's faith in Kofi eroded to nothing. The man who had once terrorized them all was now a shadow of his former self, and the villagers had begun to realize that they had nothing to fear from him anymore. Kofi's downfall had begun, and it was as if the very ground beneath him had turned to dust. As Kofi's illness continued to ravage him, his desperation grew. He had spent so many years in a position of unchallenged power, the unquestioned ruler of his household and the village. Now, all of that was slipping through his fingers, and he could do nothing to stop it. His body was weak, his mind clouded by fever, and the villagers, once loyal out of fear, were now openly avoiding him. The whispers had become a constant hum around him, and the worst blow came when the village healer, an elderly woman named Nana Amma, refused to treat him. Nana Amma had been a fixture in the village for as long as anyone could remember. Her hands had healed countless wounds and illnesses, and her wisdom was respected by all. She had been the one to care for Amina and her mother in the past, always offering her herbal remedies for common ailments and wounds. But when Kofi staggered to her humble hut one evening, desperate for help, she met him with a cold and unwavering refusal. "You are beyond help," she said, her voice low and filled with ancient authority. "The spirits have spoken, Kofi. Your evil deeds have caught up with you. I will not cure you. I will not touch you." Her words were final, as though spoken by the village itself, unwilling to forgive him for the suffering he had caused. Kofi stood there, his face contorted in disbelief. He was used to being in control, used to forcing his will on others. But now, in the face of his own frailty, he was powerless. The healer's refusal stung, more than any of his previous defeats. She was not afraid of him. She did not care about his threats or his status. The healer, with her vast knowledge and wisdom, had turned her back on him, and it was a blow that Kofi could not ignore. "I've helped you for years," he spat, his voice hoarse with anger and humiliation. "I've given you respect. You owe me your loyalty." But Nana Ama did not flinch. She simply turned her back on him, dismissing him with a wave of her hand. "You have no loyalty from me, Kofi. The spirits demand retribution. You cannot escape what you have done. You have brought this on yourself." With that, the door of the healer's hut closed in his face, leaving him standing outside in the fading light, more alone than he had ever been. For a man who had commanded the respect of an entire village, being refused help in such a way was a brutal blow to his ego. This marked a turning point. Without the healer's help, Kofi's condition only worsened. His fever spiked, his breathing labored, and his hands shook uncontrollably. He could no longer perform even the most basic tasks. He could barely walk from one room to another, let alone maintain any semblance of authority over his household or the village. It was around this time that Amina's defiance began to grow more noticeable. For years, she had quietly obeyed every cruel order, every lash of Kofi's whip, each degrading demand. But now, as she watched him weaken, she felt the growing strength of her own resolve. She had spent so long under his control, suffocating under his abuse, that the thought of defying him felt like an impossible act. But with each passing day, as she saw him becoming weaker, Amina realized that he had nothing left to hold over her. She had already made the decision to take control of her own life, and now she would take it even further. It started small. At first, it was something as simple as refusing to fetch water when he demanded it. Then, it was choosing to ignore his calls when he yelled for her to prepare his meals. He became frustrated and angry, but the longer his illness dragged on, the less able he was to do anything about it. His strength, once formidable, was gone, leaving him weak and helpless. He lashed out, of course, Kofi always lashed out, but the fire behind his words was gone. His strength had been drained by the illness, and now his physical punishment meant nothing. His words, once filled with rage and threat, fell flat. "Do as I say," he would shout weakly, his voice barely audible, his body too frail to carry the weight of his demands. But Amina stood her ground. She looked at him, her face calm, her eyes cold. "I don't have to obey you anymore," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but the words carried a weight he could not ignore. It was the first time she had openly defied him, and it was the moment that Kofi realized that his control over her had finally ended. There was no fear in her eyes, no trembling in her voice. She had taken the first step toward her freedom, and Kofi could do nothing to stop her. The villagers began to take notice of the changes. Whispers spread like wildfire, and soon, everyone knew that something was terribly wrong in Kofi's household. The once feared man was now a broken shell of his former self. His tyrannical reign had come to an end, and with it, the villagers could no longer ignore the truth about him. The elders, wise men and women who had guided the community for generations, began to sense that something deeper was at play. Kofi's condition, combined with the sudden unrest in his home, was enough to warrant a meeting. One afternoon, the village elders gathered in the square, their faces grim as they discussed Kofi's sudden fall from grace. The air was thick with tension, as if the village itself held its breath, waiting for what would come next. Amina was not invited to the meeting, but she knew that her time was coming. She could feel it. The elders had always been the guardians of justice in the village, and they were no longer willing to turn a blind eye to Kofi's abuses. As they spoke in low tones, one of the elders, a man named Kwaku, stood and addressed the group. "It is clear that something has gone wrong with Kofi," he said, his voice steady but filled with concern. "We must investigate further. His behavior has changed, and the villagers have been whispering of curses and evil deeds. The time has come to address this. We cannot let his actions go unnoticed any longer." Another elder, a woman named Akojua, nodded in agreement. "We cannot allow fear to rule our village any longer. The power Kofi once held has begun to fade, and it is time for the truth to be revealed. We must look into his past, into the suffering he has caused, and we must seek justice." The village elders called for a public meeting to address the issue, and word spread quickly. The people gathered, uneasy but curious, wondering what the elders would decide. Amina stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, her heart pounding. She had no idea what the outcome of the meeting would be, but she knew that this was the moment she had been waiting for. The village would finally see Kofi for what he truly was, and they would no longer allow his tyranny to continue. In the days that followed, the elders would uncover the truth about Kofi's reign of abuse. The people would no longer fear him. Kofi's downfall had begun, and there was no going back.